Good day, strategy gamers, and welcome back to another episode. Today is our January monthly update for our progress in the third winter. And today we're going to be taking the first step at looking at the progress in 2025 resolutions to chronicle our progress in becoming experts in select titles throughout the year. And our update today is titled The Best Laid Plans. Let's dive right on in, and we're going to begin with a little bit of a status update on what I'll call the production calendar. So some of this is related to, say, what you can expect to see on YouTube, but other portions of this are to just give a little bit of a full calendar year look at what we're going to be trying to tackle. So as mentioned in the annual update video about a month ago, we have a couple of games that we're going to be really focusing in on throughout the entire year. And this monthly update is for the third winter, which you see in the first row. And we're plotting out just by month at a high level what are our targets for each of those months. And then corresponding to each game, when can you expect to see update videos that are specific to that game? So in any given month, we might still talk about all three games, but as you're about to see as we get into this video, we will go specifically very in-depth related to a particular game each month, and in most of the months, we will actually be looking at two different games. So for example, in February, we'll have another status update video on our progress in the campaign scenario for the third winter, but then in March, we will have another for the third winter, and then we will have a second monthly video produced that looks specifically at my progress in tackling Federation and Empire. And we'll be looking at my progress in trying to conquer the Wind scenario, which is one of the many scenarios that game system comes with. And then in Pacific War, we can start to see specific content to that game in April. But again, we'll begin just a little earlier than that. You'll notice there's a little bit of a curve to the start of different content for these three games, and that's a little representative of where I'm coming in terms of experience with each of these games and their systems. So with the third winter, we're diving right in, beginning of the year, starting with the grand campaign for that particular game. And one of the reasons for that is I'm very familiar with OCS. Not an expert, but I'm in a position where I'm pretty fluent with the rules. I don't need to spend a lot of time trying to understand the game or the system, so feel a lot more comfortable just diving right into the deep end and investing the bulk of our time for 2025 in really trying to master the grand campaign game that the third winter comes with. And that's what most of the content will be about. Whereas Federation and Empire is a game that I have, as of this moment, not yet played. There's also not a lot of content out there on YouTube about Federation and Empire, and the rules are pretty heavy, especially when you start to look at all of the additional modules. So there we're going to work our way up by looking at smaller scenarios, and then we'll try to get to the campaign scenario, and I'd say the last quarter of the year. And then Pacific War, it's a game that I am familiar with. I really enjoy it. I've played it a number of times, but I have not yet really experienced it at a larger campaign level. So we're just going to slowly work our way up to the full campaign scenario by doing the Guadalcanal campaign and then the War in the Central Pacific scenario, which I think will be a good setup for going into the campaign scenario. So I'll also be tagging each month as we do these updates, the progress that we have on here. So you can see the third winter, it is set up, it's ready to go, and you're going to see a lot of detail about it here in this video. And we also have the update video going out on schedule. This is still releasing in January, which is very exciting and on time. But when we look at rules, from a little bit of a project management perspective, that's marked yellow. I had really thought I would be further along in feeling like I grasp the rules of the Federation and Empire game. I have been putting quite a few hours into trying to learn the game, but frankly, I'm just not quite there yet where I feel the comfort level that I want it to come the end of January here. So really just going to try to put a little bit more time into that the first part of February, which I wasn't expecting to do. I was expecting to focus more so on the scenario, but we will buckle down and make sure we're in a good spot to get lots of gameplay in February and March in Federation and Empire. And then next month too, we're just going to be doing a little bit of a refresher. I will, at least for myself, the rules on Pacific War. Again, familiar with it, but not necessarily a high fluency level with all the rules, just stepping into it. A lot of cobwebs to dust off there. So this is our status update for what we have coming up in 2025. I will do my best to stick to this and give you updates as we progress each and every month. For this video, though, a couple of agenda items. We'll first be going over just, I think it's really important to cite where I have found great content, resources, and give credit where credit's due in kind of inspiring some of my thoughts behind the content that you'll find inside of this particular video. So I want to just give a shout out to those first and also reference them so you can explore additional content about this game if you are so inclined. We'll also then talk about the series objectives. So just again to reframe a little from that annual video, why we're doing this. Then we'll be going over to look at the setups, just some high-level setup information, just a couple of tips and such that I had experienced from setting up the game myself, and some numbers for you who may be interested in what does it take to set up the full campaign. The bulk of this video and episode, though, is going to be about planning. So as of the moment of recording, I have not started turn 1 as of yet. You may also just noticed in some pictures, right, that maybe there is still a supply that has not been allocated, or you may notice a lack of reserve markers, etc. Pretty much we have all the pictures and planning that's captured here is just strictly from the setup notes from the scenario book. So still just a few tweaks to do before I dive right into turn 1 and all of those initial steps. So really thinking more so just about the planning aspects at this point. So talking about really some credits and inspiration, there are a few that really stand out top of the list for me, although this won't ever be able to be fully comprehensive of every material out there on OCS that's inspired me, but some big ones would be from the Operational Matters Volume 2 magazine. Specifically the articles by Tony's Top 10 Tips on OCS Strategy and Top 12 Tactical Tips for OCS really gave me a lot of inspiration as I thought about how I wanted to think about my planning for this larger campaign scenario that we're doing. Really, really valuable insights there. And I can only imagine Tony's frustration at having two different articles, one with 10 tips and one with 12 tips, but regardless, they turned out just great. The next is Chip Saltzman did a wonderful after-action report, which can be found on the OCS Depot, that actually covers his experience with some others in one of their playthroughs of the full campaign game. Would really recommend giving that a read, and they did a great job documenting their game there. The other would be the Dnieper battles, which was another after-action report. This was by user Cornish Boy on the Board Game Geek forums for the third winter, which you can find that on Board Game Geek. And then the last one would be, it's not actually about an OCS title, although Dickie on RVT Wargames does have OCS content. Specifically, his video and some others in this series of how to command successfully in BCS Games Battalion Combat Series, I found how he put together his insights, his planning, how he thought about the game from a top-down level really to be the right approach and something that I've tried to replicate here. So I want to make sure he gets credit that he inspired me in the approach that I've taken with a lot of this content on this video. To the right, just a list of resources. I won't rattle through every single one, but the first would just be OCSdepot.com. If you've never been there and you want to play OCS, go to OCSdepot.com. Easy URL, has everything that you need really to get diving deep into OCS from the community and the publisher. I'd also like to give a shout out to OCS World, a YouTube channel that has a great playthrough for Smolensk, as well as a great tutorial series that folks that are newer to the series should check out. And then I would also just say my campaign material as I go through all of these videos and throughout this year, I'm going to be sharing all of this through links in the video descriptions, where you'll be able to see these presentations, the journaling that I'm taking as I go through every turn. I'll probably have some sheets, Google Sheets, that I'll be maintaining that may be of interest to folks that want to get into maybe some of the data that I'm collecting on my playthrough. So please make sure to check that out in the video description if you have a chance. So with that, let's talk now objectives. So if you didn't get a chance to see the previous video I did earlier in January, what I'm trying to do in 2025 is focus on a couple of select titles, the Third Winter being one of them, Pacific War another, as well as Downfall and Federation and Empire. And the first objective that I really have is for myself to develop an expertise in strategies for these games, their game or series specific rules, and how I think about the larger campaign games that they all present and how to plan for them, how to implement those strategies and learnings through the planning process. And for all the games really that we're going to be diving deep into for these videos, they have large, I would almost call all of them monster campaigns. For a lot of people, they would consider it such. For a lot of folks, these games may not even fit on their regular dining table, or if it fits, it's not something that everybody will be able to invest 200 hours into playing. And I think that's a fair enough definition of a monster campaign game. So that's my goal, is to really try to develop an expertise in these games, not in the interest of trying to be competitive, but rather to just try to get a new experience out of the hobby that I haven't had so far, where it's fun looking at new games, new innovation, new mechanics, etc., new themes as they come out. But I feel I have spent historically less time on really trying to become an expert in these games. So that's the first objective. The second is all of that which I just said. I really want to try to document my experience and journey as I try to become an expert in the game. What were things that helped me learn lessons or learn new strategies? What were different approaches that I took to the planning or the setup of the campaign games? And really, from that, if the documentation can in any way be helpful to somebody else who has the same ambition to take one of these titles and become more of an expert in it, then that's mission accomplished for that objective. And then lastly, and this is as much my own just self-discipline as anything else, but to really be consistent in my play, how I'm documenting my experiences and my learnings, and making sure that it turns into a regular habit and consistent action that I'm taking in the hobby. So I've set even more detailed goals for myself that I won't be putting out here, but I'm trying to hold myself to throughout the year on, what mix of my gaming experience do I really try to focus on these? How do I try to limit the distractions of newer titles, etc.? And it's for my own growth, but also I think it will build upon and help the two previously mentioned objectives I'm trying to achieve. So it also is a little bit of a reason some may ask, why do you have 3 different games on your production calendar? Why not just do the Third Winter for 3 months and then do Federation and Empire and then do Pacific War for 3 months? I have to admit and recognize that my eye will still be caught by other things, and sometimes I'm just in interest to play more of a naval game, and Pacific War scratches that itch perfectly. Other times I might be reading a great, science fiction book or something like that, and maybe Star Trek Federation and Empire is a great itch for it at that given time. So I'm trying to make sure that I've got a couple of different options that, even if the specific title of the 3 may vary on any given day of the week, that at the very least I'm staying true to those 3 games and investing that consistent time into them regularly. So these are my objectives for the series. and really excited to have you along for the ride as we go through this year and beyond. So taking a look at the third winter and its setup, which really was the large task in January. It did not take the whole month of January. I finished, I think it was almost 2 weeks ago, almost halfway through the month. But really just wanted to document a couple things here for you. So it took me about 13 hours and 40 minutes. I am quite certain that I am slower than most at setting this up. So I've seen some others out there on forums and such say that, these campaigns are games with similarly sized campaigns. Setup takes between 6 and 8 hours. I think if you're really, really focused on that, no distractions, and just try to hammer through it, 6 to 8 hours is probably a very reasonable amount of time. But I took a more casual pace with this as I did the setup for this game. So I actually used a little bit of an activity tracker app as I logged the time, and I'm going to keep using it for other video updates that I have throughout the year. But in total, 7 different days I tried to do setup. So it averaged out to about 2 hours for each of the days that I committed towards doing setup on the game. And, on one day it might have been 1 hour. On a Saturday morning, maybe it was 3 hours. So it's an average, certainly. I also had some rough numbers on the number of counters that were placed onto the map. My math came out to be about 875. I'm sure a Tony or a Chip Saltzman or someone has a more specific number of what it should be when you do the campaign setup that's more exact, but I came out to 875 counters. And if you do the math, that comes out to be about 1 minute per counter that's set up on the map. I actually am pretty happy with that metric. And again, I can certainly see others that are maybe more familiar with the setup or just are maybe more concentrated than I would be able to go through that a little bit more quickly. There was one notable exception where I just, for the life of me, could not find one particular unit that I was trying to find. And I probably spent 20, almost 30 minutes looking for it, right? So I was fair, and that could happen to somebody else, so I included it in the number in terms of how long it took me to do this setup. I'm actually surprised that there was only one instance that I had that was really an outlier that took me that long to find it, but really that's where a lot of the time came in my experience during the setup, was there being a specific unit that for some reason or another I just couldn't find. I think something that maybe had contributed to that is I have played a fair amount of the Third Winter in the past, and while I'm happy with my 3D printed trays and the organization structure that I use for them, mistakes can be made when you're putting the game back into the tray setup. I find that when you first break a brand new game open and you're doing the organization while you're clipping, you generally then will have an easier experience doing setup, because during play, as you put counters back, it's a little easier to be inconsistent in using the same organizational structure as you want to have. So I did find that I had, a counter in one slot on the tray that I would have expected to be in another, and that slowed me down, right? But what I did find helpful was for the multi-unit formations to organize them all separately into stacks, kind of like you see here in the picture. And then infantry divisions, I put those into piles just based off of, is there infantry division designation between 0 and 100, greater than 250, etc., just to try to make it a little bit easier to find the infantry divisions and taking them out of the trays, so that way every unit could be seen a little bit more easily without having to dig through a stack. So I found all of that to be pretty helpful. And then just working your way through page by page, and I actually printed out an extra copy instead of using my scenario book that came with my copy of the game. And you can see it in that picture. I just kind of made a little check next to each unit as I placed it down, so that way I had good confidence that if I had to step away or if I had to resume following day, that I knew where I left off and that I wasn't going to be missing or assuming that I had gotten that previous unit onto the map in the previous row. So I myself found that pretty helpful as I went through and did the setup, and would recommend the same tips for you guys if you give it a try. So, planning. Let's talk about planning. What we have right here is the Third Winter map. And each of these icons on the map represent, to some degree, a victory hex of some kind. Now, I'm not going to go into the conditions or values of each of these victory locations, as they do vary, but I want to try to show you visually the distribution of victory point locations on the map as we think about planning. And for the purposes of these following sections, I'm largely going to be speaking with the voice of, say, the Soviet player. And the reason for that is the Soviets, as the offensive posture player, they have to take the initiative, the action to achieve these different victory points, whereas the Axis player is more responsive and defensive in nature in this particular title. Very engaging and very happy with how that plays out, but I think it's a little easier from a planning perspective if I think about it as the detailed plans of the Soviets, and then we will close with general concepts for the Axis on how we want to do our planning. So when we have any given game, such as the Third Winter, you start out with, okay, here are the Axis forces, here are the Soviet forces, they're lined up, and we want to go from the east to the west. We want to go right to left, and if we can move across the map in such a fashion, pushing back the Axis forces, we will eventually achieve victory. Right? Very simple, very easy to understand. Congratulations, presentation over. Let's just hop on to the next month worth of activities. Well, not quite. Again, we want to try to become better experts in our planning and the strategies involved in this game. So that's the most simplistic view you could take of what the plan would be. You're the Soviets, press and race as quickly as you can to the west side of the map and you will win. But let's break it down now, step by step, until we find ourselves with a more comprehensive plan. So really, it's not that it's some straight uniform line with the Axis forces and the Soviet forces. In fact, there's a little bit of a shape to the front line that is not, perpendicular to the map, and rather curves, and largely curves around the geographic feature that is the Dnieper River that runs here through Ukraine. And these icons represent roughly where that line takes shape across the front line in the Third Winter. And now if we apply that same concept, that great, this is the starting point. It's more nuanced. We still want to get to the west and advance and achieve victory, right? Let's just get to the end of the map and we win. Good in concept, but we run into some difficulties with that thinking. The first is that the Third Winter introduces these 4 Ukrainian fronts, and these are Soviet formations, you can think of them as, and they go from north to south, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ukrainian Front. Well, fronts in this game for the Soviets have postures, and without getting too deep into a teach on it, the postures alternate between an offensive posture and a regrouping posture. And when you're regrouping, it's really hard to advance. And when you're in an offensive posture, it's easier to advance. So you have these 4 Ukrainian fronts, and as they advance, because of that dynamic, they're not going to advance at the same pace. So not only do they have a different distance that they need to advance to get to, say, the far west map edge, you also have a dynamic where each of these fronts is not going to be able to progress at the same rate as the other fronts. So here we see this visualization that each front will probably advance at a different rate and in different increments than the other fronts. But in the end, if we get to the far west side of the map, we're probably still going to win. So coming from a little bit of my business background bleeding into this video, we know that our objective, our milestone, is to get to the far west map edge so that way we can achieve as many victory point locations as possible. Great. But any objective or milestone needs a time dimension, a time element to it, right? So what I've laid here visually for you on the map is increments of 5 hexes across those 4 different fronts. And if you were to say that turn 60 is when the game will end, giving us some breathing room, it's actually a variable end time for the game, so it's not going to be the same every playthrough necessarily. We're just going to keep the math simple and say turn 60 is when we want to achieve most of our victory point conditions. If we set that as the target and work our way backwards to where each of the fronts starts, where do we have to be by each given turn to hit the far west map edge by turn 60? That's really what this exercise is demonstrating. It's as simplistic as it can be. So you can see that for the first Ukrainian front here on the north of the map, they want to be just a little bit past Kiev by the 5th turn. By the 10th turn, they want to be here within this hex grid. Conversely, when you look at the 4th Ukrainian front, by turn 3, they need to make it quite a distance. By turn 6, even further, right? Their rate of advance has to be faster than the 1st Ukrainian front, which starts more advanced at the top of the map. So what this view does is gives us a highly preliminary understanding of, okay, how far do we need to be by each given turn end to make it to the end of the map by turn 60 and achieve those objectives. But of course, it's a little more complicated than that. Of course it is. Because when you look at the objectives, you can see that, look at the middle of the map. Once you reach a certain point, there's really not a benefit from going further to the west with the 2nd or the 3rd Ukrainian front. The last victory point location in the band that is the 3rd Ukrainian front is right here. Whereas when you look at the 1st Ukrainian front, they have an objective that is all the way at the end of the map edge. And I should point out too, as I forgot to mention, each of these fronts in the game have a radius, if you will, that they can, apply their benefits. And it's roughly cutting the map north to south into 4 different sections. It's not perfect math that way, but it's kind of how it works out. So the theory being that each would just north to south have their radius and move east to west. When we look at the bottom for the 4th, down here, this is the last victory point objective they need to get to. So this now gives us a little bit more variety in how far do we want to advance. And the math is then updated to reflect these new endpoints that we want to be at for each front. You'll note as well that I actually, for the 2nd Ukrainian front, had them advance further than their last victory objective hex, because I didn't want the 1st Ukrainian front to have too much of their flank exposed and really terrain that's not easily defensible to access counterattack. So thought being that the 2nd Ukrainian front would go a little bit beyond their victory objective to help cover the southern flank of the 1st Ukrainian front. So this now gives us updated targets of where do we want each front to be approximately, by what turn. That will then be a good measuring stick, imperfect as it may be, but a measuring stick to know, are we making good progress to reach our objectives in the campaign by turn 60? And it also then allows us to respond and say, well, if the 1st Ukrainian front and the 2nd Ukrainian front are well on schedule, maybe they're even ahead of schedule, but the 4th Ukrainian front is way behind on this schedule, it then gives us some indication that the 4th Ukrainian front needs more attention, more resources, and maybe we can deprioritize efforts in the 1st and the 2nd Ukrainian front. So it gives a good comparison between the fronts as well. So the next thing to kind of consider, and you can visually pick up on this, but I wanted to put the numbers actually onto the screen. How many hexes, in terms of hex columns, does each front need to advance throughout the campaign to reach their objectives? And here you see there's a great disparity amongst the different fronts, which is seen visually as well. 85 hex columns is how far the 4th Ukrainian Front has to advance, which means every turn, they're advancing 5 hexes every 3 to 4 turns, which is really quite substantial, because that then means that you have a pace of advancing more than a hex every single turn. Whereas the 2nd Ukrainian Front, they don't even need to advance a hex every turn to hit their end objective by the time everything's said and done. So that rate of progression helps us understand then a little bit about where we need to prioritize maybe the resource allocation. So with that, I'm putting these high-level priority allocations onto each of the fronts. The 4th Ukrainian Front will be the top priority, just given the distance that it needs to cover to hit that victory point location that's in the bottom left corner of the map. Second priority will be the 3rd Ukrainian Front, as they have the next largest distance to cover, followed by the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian Front for 3rd and 4th priorities. So now, when we think about the ability to advance in OCS, what's the big theme of this series? Supply. And this little table tries to break down how we're going to do supply allocation. This is not meant to be a rigid structure. Again, the purpose of this is to say, we have almost 1,000 counters on the board. We're going to spend between probably 200 and 300 hours playing this game over the course of 6 months. You need some type of structure and planning to make sure that you have a coherent strategy from beginning to end, and a process and method that allows you to adapt to the changing circumstances. So the very first thing that I wanted to do was calculate what's the average amount of supply we would get on any given turn, assuming a 7-die roll on the supply table. The supply table actually has a modification once you enter 1944. So the number actually comes out to be about 19 average supply points per turn. Again, using 60 turns just as that baseline for when the game would end, this means we're going to have 1,140 points of supply on average for the Soviets during this game. When we look at the different fronts, we see that the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian Front begin in offensive postures, and the 3rd and 4th Ukrainian Front begin in regrouping postures. And that's important, and we'll come to that later when we get into more detail about their strategies. If we were to give every front an equal supply distribution, that would be 285 supply points each. We then see the planned distance that we have for each front, and it calculates out to say, okay, if you gave that equal supply distribution over that planned distance, what's that average supply per hex that is actually needed? So here you see this great discrepancy, which means that the 4th Ukrainian Front needs to use, say, 1/5 of a supply point, or less than 1 token per hex column it advances. That's pretty aggressive. Whereas you're saying the 2nd Ukrainian Front, they can actually use more than 1 token, 1/3 of a supply point for every hex column that they're advancing there. So those are really variances that we want to try to normalize. So when we think about our priorities of the fronts, if we give them a priority weighting of plus or minus 25% or plus or minus 10%, that then gives us a different supply distribution based off priority. And you can see the math actually works out quite nicely. And I would be intrigued to know if, whether it be Chip or Tony, if they had some type of similar process as they thought about the supply availability in the game, that really you get about a token per hex that you want to advance across the map. That seems very normalized and something that we can handle then in a logical way as we think about the supply allocation. But what the table then does for us is it tells us that on an average turn, how many supply points are we going to give to each of these fronts? So that way, every turn we take, we don't necessarily have to think about what is the calculation distance of how far they have to go versus how much supply they need. So you can see that the 4th Ukrainian Front, on an average turn, we're going to give almost 6 supply points to, whereas the 2nd Ukrainian Front, the average turn, and of course average is a really important word here, we're going to give them 3.5 supply points per turn. Now, what I will be doing is, as I mentioned, I'm going to have a lot of documentation about my playthrough and how I'm trying to learn from all of this. One of those things I'll have in the documentation is a full breakdown and accounting for all the supply points and kind of where they're distributed, how they're used, etc. So hopefully then by the time we get to the end of the campaign, we can paint a nice little visual, if you will, about the supply point investment to the return that we got towards achieving our objectives. A couple of call outs that are important to remember is that you still need to think about the posture of the front, because that has consequences on how effective the front can be at actually advancing. A regrouping front is actually very difficult to advance with, or at the very least, it's much more difficult than a front that is in the offensive posture. It also just frankly doesn't consider the terrain that is across those hexes they have to advance, or how my opponent is going to respond to my actions. So that caveat's always going to exist, and the purpose of this supply allocation is not to represent a perfect model of the universe in this game of supply allocation, but rather to give us a starting point. Because over such a time length, over so many decision points, it's good to always have a reference point to come back to. And this will be our reference point. If every turn we're giving the 2nd Ukrainian Front 7 supply points, because turn by turn we feel like that's what's needed, this gives us a good reference point to say, ooh, we need to think about the long-term consequences of that decision. So that's how we'll think about supply as we go through this campaign. The next thing is, I just want to break this down. I have invented some of my own terminology that, perhaps has been used elsewhere. Maybe I picked up somewhere, but this is trying to represent how I'm thinking about the groupings of my units as the Soviet player and the plans that I'm going to try to put into place. So we have 4 fronts, and each front is going to have multiple sectors. And those sectors really are just geographic areas of operations or objectives that each front will have and be responsible for. And then each sector, we will largely, it won't be a perfect science, but we will largely be trying to attach formations or independent units to those sectors to try to achieve the objectives of that sector. So that's kind of our hierarchy that I wanted to talk about before we get into these next slides, which address more directly what our plans will be. The first front that we'll talk about is the 1st Ukrainian Front. Their posture is offensive, which means they will have benefits to taking offensive actions through the game-specific mechanics and rules. The 1st Ukrainian Front is going to be split up into 3 sectors. The Ivanikov sector, the Kiev sector, and the Mironoka sector. So when we look at it on the map on the right, you can see those sectors kind of broken out visually in where the front is operating. For really looking at Kiev and the north side of the map, the Ivanikov sector, there's not a lot of areas of exploitation. The greatest opportunity for the front really lives with the 8th Guards Tank Corps that exists more so towards the south by the Mironoka sector. And we'll be looking at that in more detail here. And that's a breakout that's already happening across the Dnieper, and something that we'll want to take full advantage of to make sure that the Axis has to respond to that threat. Looking at the Ivanikov sector in more detail, their strategy is going to just be building up the line a little bit more closely there on the north map edge. The 16th Tank Corps is going to have the responsibility of trying to tie down the 8th Panzer, so that way the 8th Panzer cannot relocate south to help with Kiev or counterattack there. And there's a little bit of a bridge that we can try to take advantage of across the Dnieper with the 16th Tank Corps. Really, other than that, the infantry formations north and south of the 16th Tank Corps are just going to be trying to take a holding position, or if an opportunity presents itself, cross the river. One thing that really is a difficulty in this sector, though, is that if you look at the map, there's no rail line going east-west in this part of the map. You have to go down to Kiev to find that. There's just the one road that crosses the river, so you just worry a little bit about the supply situation given that. So it's not an area that we're going to try to exploit too strongly unless an opportunity presents itself. I also note in each of these sector breakdowns the current supply availability. This is the supply availability that one was available from the game campaign setup, just placement of supply onto the map. So this has no reflection on any supply table roles or anything like that at present. But two, I will be trying to assign to each sector explicit locations of supply as the game progresses, and I'll be tracking them through these updates in this format. For the Kiev sector, we largely want to hold the line in and around Kiev. It would be, I think, very costly, especially from a supply perspective, trying to push through those infantry formations that are in the city. We have infantry there, and you can just even see from this snapshot, therefore action rating in very defensible terrain versus our 2 action ratings. Already that's a recipe that is, I would say, maybe normal for the Soviet player, but becomes especially pronounced in difficulty when we have difficult terrain such as we're facing in Kiev itself. Better option, in my opinion, is to try to go around Kiev, which is not a novel concept by any means, but it's what we'll be taking. So with that, we'll look for the 7th Guard motorized corps to south of the city, if possible, cross the river and really engage and lock down the 20th Panzer Group division to prevent them from either moving north for a counterattack in Kiev or moving south to help relieve efforts around Mironoka sector. The Mironoka sector itself actually has a lot of opportunity that we're going to be focusing on. And this sector is where most of our attention is going to be for the first few turns in the first Ukrainian front. You see here that we're already across the river, namely with the 8th Guard Tank Corps. And we have a lot of different taskings here to talk about. So the first is that I want the 8th Guard Tank Corps to try to push directly towards Mironoka proper, and there's a rail line leading to that city that ultimately crosses the Dnieper. We want to try to capture that junction, one, for the future of our own supply network, but also to, as quickly as possible, try to prevent the use of that junction by the Axis. The 3rd Guard Tank Corps is going to engage the 19th Panzer, and that will also try to protect the northern flank of 8th Guard Tank Corps' advance towards Mironoka. And then we'll have the 10th Tank Corps protect the south flank, and that still has to come across the river as well, but there's a clear path to do so, and we want that to try to block off those infantry elements from disrupting the advance of the 8th Guard Tank Corps. And if possible, we want 10th Tank Corps to advance towards Kherson and really put more pressure on the 10th Panzer Group and the elements further to the east of Kherson. The 1st Guard Cav is going to follow the 8th Guard Tank Corps and then ultimately veer northwest towards Belaya Terskov. And if we can capture that rail line leading up to Belaya Terskov, that will be an added benefit. And the 9th Tank Corps is going to move from its more reserve position currently in that stack with the air front, and really just be looking for opportunities to exploit in the line that the other elements create. So that's the sector for Marinolka, and really the overall strategy that we have for the first Ukrainian front. The second Ukrainian front is also in an offensive posture, so more opportunity here that we want to take advantage of while we're in an offensive posture. The terrain that's immediately ahead or represents the current front line is really some of the more difficult terrain that we have to navigate across the whole north to south front line that we have. So that presents a challenge. However, when you look at the map, especially in this snapshot, you can see that the Germans don't currently have very well established lines of defense along that terrain at present. There is a large number of forces available, but they are not distributed in some coherent line of defense. We also have a significant opportunity as we look at our Kremenchug sector to cut off those infantry formations that are on the wrong side of the Dnieper, that are running north-south on the 36th and 35th hex column. So that rail line that runs on the 29th hex column north-south is very important to us as we think about cutting off those infantry formations, but also as we think about crossing the river. So two sectors here, the Kremenchug sector as well as the Cherkasy sector. For the Cherkasy sector, the primary objective is going to be the multiple formations the Axis has, the 3rd Panzer, 11th Panzer, and 5th Panzer elements, and trying to prevent them from redeploying to counterattack the exploitation of the Marinolka sector. So what we don't want is these units to make it back across the river and to move northwest to try to cut off the 8th Guard Tank Corps and supporting elements. So that's the first objective, is to really try to tie those down. And also the same can be said for the 10th Panzer Group that sits between the two sectors. So the 5th Guard motorized there, we want them to try to engage with the 10th Panzer Group. We want the 1st motorized, which is actually off map a little bit, to move up and support the elements of the 3rd Guard motorized. And the 3rd Guard motorized has really got a tough job on its hands, but is trying to tie down the 5th, 11th, and 3rd Panzer groups that are right there around the river crossing. So quite a bit for this sector to be responsible for. If an opportunity presents itself, we do want to try to have the 5th Guard motorized see if they can't work their way between 10th Panzer Group and 11th Panzer Group. Right now, there is quite a bit of an opening there. It is very difficult terrain, which would make us worry about our supply situation and our movement point costs to navigate it. But there might be a little bit of a gap that we want to try to shoot and put pressure on, I think, between those two formations that they need to address. For the Kremenchug sector, here really it's a race, and this is an exciting one to talk about. The Cliff Notes version is we have tanks, we have a lot of them, we have open terrain in front of us, and we have an enemy that we can try to cut off and surround in a pocket. So really the first priority is just that north-south 29 hex column rail line that I mentioned earlier. We want to dispatch the 4th Guard tanks and 5th Guard tanks elements to go south on that as quickly as they can, to take as much of that territory as we can, to prevent an orderly fallback of the German infantry formations that find themselves on the other side of the Dnieper. The 31st Tank Corps that is to the west of those elements, we want them to head south to put pressure on that 6th Panzer Division and prevent them from trying to cut off or establish a good line of defense across the Dnieper there. And then the infantry formations that are kind of spread out right now to the northwest of Poltava, we want them to just move south and really cover that east flank of the advancing 4th Guard tank and 5th Guard tank corps. So really a little bit of a race and adrenaline feel as I look at this section of the map, and excited to see how we can try to take advantage of this opportunity. The third Ukrainian front is the first that we look at that is in a regrouping posture. What this means is there's a number of modifiers using the Ukrainian front mechanics that make it much more difficult to actually conduct attacks and a lot less beneficial, especially than an offensive posture. So with that, these two fronts, third and fourth Ukrainian, are largely not going to have too much going on, but where there's opportunities, we're going to try to touch on them. We have two sectors with the third Ukrainian front, the Poltava front, and then the Dnipropetrovsk. Going to have to try to say that 17 times to make sure I get that enunciation correctly. Sectors that we're going to be focusing on with the third Ukrainian front, and we'll take a look next at the Poltava sector. So this is actually a little bit of a logistics hub, a junction that sits in our kind of rear areas right now. And the Germans have declared it a fortress city, so they're trying to hold out and keep it as long as they can. Given the posture of the front and given the opportunities that exist to exploit breakthroughs elsewhere on the map, we are really going to have to take our time and not prioritize clearing out this pocket. It's a little painful because it's going to slow down our logistics in the back, but I just feel we need to put the resources elsewhere and really have to try to leverage the out of supply rules and barrages maybe to try to wear down these forces that are in Poltava. So really not an area of focus. So the formation tasking is going to be those that are currently in contact and surrounding Poltava are going to stay put for the most part, hold down that situation. Whereas the other infantry formations, I want them continuing on as quickly as they can towards the Dnieper River. Specifically, I want these heading southwest, closer to the other sector that the third Ukrainian front has. And speaking of that, here we have the Dnipropetrovsk sector, and we're going to make just a small effort to try to put pressure on threatening a crossing of the Dnieper River here. Again, with the posture, our hands are a little tied on how much we could exploit this situation. But what I want to try to do is I want to make sure that the Axis player has to at least consider their force allocation in preventing us from easily getting across the Dnieper in some of these spots that are highlighted. So the infantry formations with the 46th Army, they're going to head towards that opening between the Hedgehog units and the German, the 52nd Corps, I think. And then the 12th Army formations are going to come in just to the northwest of the city there and kind of put the same pressure on the enemy. So not trying to do too much here with this particular sector. Fourth Ukrainian front, so this is the very south edge of the map and the last front that we have to talk about. So with this front, it's a little interesting because I do anticipate that in the far south edge of the map there around Melitopol that we will see the Germans likely start their own withdrawal without our pressure, because if you look further to the west, largely for the entire front, but notably here in the far south, there's really just not a single hex that has good defensible terrain. And whereas most of the map that we've reviewed so far, there's a river or strong terrain hexes that allow for a good defense of the area by the Germans, in this part of the map, there's nothing. And I just anticipate that we'll probably see them slowly withdraw from this area. When we look at Zaporizhia, that's kind of in the middle, it's very congested. One benefit that I see here, though, is that the city actually sits on the east side of the river. And why I think that's important is that's a lot of clear terrain then once we get through the city and to the other side of the river. a lot of times you can get a little bogged down when you have these cities that sit on rivers, because on one side you clear through terrain or maybe a city hex, but then you have more city hexes to go through, preventing a fast breakout once you cross the river on the other side. Here, that's not the case. So I'm hoping that we can use that to our advantage. And then the Dnipropetrovsk sector, interestingly, actually sits between the two different fronts. So that actually does open up a few possibilities for us that we'll talk about. That Dnipropetrovsk sector, we're not going to go crazy here, but because it sits between the two fronts, we are going to probably use some of the supply that's available to these units within range and try to actually push through the south side of Dnipropetrovsk. So 23rd Tank Corps, we want to try to overrun that bridgehead that's in the city there. And then the 7th Motorized is just going to be in standby if we're successful to try to break across the river and see how they can exploit that opportunity. The Zaporizhzhia sector, here we're really just going to try to fill in that bend that is north of the river to again threaten and make sure the German forces are trying to allocate their resources for a comprehensive defense of the entire front line. So it's just going to be a posturing and maneuvering in a defensive position for a lot of these forces. And then that Melitopol sector, it's largely the same situation here, where if we do see the German forces conduct a withdrawal, we want to be ready and really take opportunity as quickly as possible to grab bridgeheads across the Dnieper, as down here on the south half of the map, it is a Volga-class river, which has more defensive qualities to it. So it's more important than ever that on the south edge of the map here, if we can capture bridgeheads while the enemy is retreating, we want to make sure we do so. So to that end as well, what I plan to do is during the supply allocation, you do, not to get too into the weeds, but you do have to give supply to each of the fronts. You can't ignore a front in your supply distribution with the game-specific rules. A lot of the supply that the 4th Ukrainian Front is going to get in these initial turns, I think I'm going to allocate to the Melitopol sector, because I want some of these formations like the 5th Guard Cav, the 2nd Guard Motorized, the 20th Tank Corps. I want them to have plenty of fuel in their engines to really blitz across this open plain if we have such an opportunity. So this was a lot of talk about the Soviet planning, but let's talk just a little bit about the Axis planning. So as I mentioned earlier, just given the nature of the defensive posture that the Axis are going to take throughout this 60-turn campaign game, I'm instead going to try to just have a couple of principles and really react as best I can playing solitaire here with the Axis, and have these as things to prioritize and keep in mind. The first is to really try to optimize how many resources we put towards defending city fortresses or just in general cities and bridgeheads. And what I mean by that is I think it's important to recognize there's a balance between putting too much into a fortress city, and then when it eventually does get surrounded and a pocket is closed around it, that you've committed too much and you now have less in your future endeavors to defend a front line. But put too little, and it doesn't really act as a stopping mechanism to the enemy's advance either. So just trying to learn where that optimized resource commitment is to some of those hexes, I think will be very important. I also want to stress in my strategy here, and I don't know that this is the right thought, but I'm going with it here for our first campaign playthrough. When I look for counterattacks, I'm going to try to look for counterattacks that restrict Soviet supply. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think often in these East Front games, especially when it's the Axis that are on the defense, you may sometimes look for counterattacks that also have attrition to enemy units. They might pose the risk of being encircled, cut off, etc. I really want to focus my counterattacks towards maneuvers that impact the supply and logistics or the advance of the enemy, not necessarily, which counterattack numerically puts the most Soviet forces at risk of attrition. The other concept is that when one of the Soviet fronts is in the offensive maneuver mode, or posture, I want to be adjusting myself into better defensive positions, have a more fluid line, because the Soviets have more than enough to be able to break through my front lines. There's no question about it. There's no Maginot Line that's going to actually work here on this map. And when they're in the offensive posture, their benefits are so great that I don't want to have too much direct contact on the front line in those situations. Conversely, when the Soviet front is regrouping is their posture, I really don't want to easily give up ground, because unless I pull back, unless I retreat or give them an opening, it's very difficult for them to have the same success in offensive operations. So I want to try to manage that balance as best I can. Where I think it will prove difficult and a challenge is that, of course, as we've looked at from a very high strategic level, these four fronts are not all on the same north-south hex column to begin, or will they end that way? And you want to make sure that as you're responding to the advances and regroupings of the different Soviet fronts, that you don't position yourself where one of your sectors of defense can too easily be flanked by the Soviet front that is in fact advancing. So there'll be a little bit of nuance, I think, in how I manage that situation, but those are two concepts I want to try to maintain. This has been a lot to go through. This is the type of deep dive that, whether it be for the Third Winter, Federation and Empire, Pacific War, that I want to be taking in all of these monthly status updates. So in the next one in February, we're not going to be talking about necessarily planning, although there'll be a little bit of an element to that. I want to go into a similar level of detail, recapping from an AAR perspective, how has the game been progressing for approximately the first 10 turns is what I think I'll get through about in February. So that's going to be what will be coming in the next video. And then equally in the other games, we'll do similar type of deep dives into different elements of planning, recaps of activities that have been happening, strategies and learnings that I've experienced through the playthroughs, etc. So hope you've been enjoying this. As always, thank you so much for your support of the videos and the channel. It is greatly appreciated. Really curious to hear your thoughts on this format and this plan for going forward on the channel. And as always, strategy gamers, hoping you have yourselves an excellent day. Bye now.